I'm Robert Doar, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this event, a conversation with Senator Mitt Romney, the future of conservative family policy. It's a great honor to welcome Senator Romney to AEI. He is the former governor of Massachusetts, the 2012 Republican nominee for president, and since 2019, he's been a United States Senator from Utah. In the Senate, he has worked on new ways to address the challenges facing American families. And that effort has become increasingly relevant both to American society and the conservative movement. Families are the most basic institution of American life, and like many of our institutions, they are in decline. Senator Romney, along with Senator Steve Daines of Montana and Senator Richard Burr of North Carolina, recently proposed the Family Security Act 2.0, which would provide a child benefit that may have some advantages over some of the other proposals going around town. And we are honored that Senator Romney has chosen AEI to present and discuss this proposed legislation, which aims to tackle one of the toughest issues in our country and society. Now, after his presentation, Senator Romney and I will sit down to discuss the proposal. I spent some time tackling these issues of family formation and employment as a social services administrator and as a scholar here at AEI, where our poverty scholars, including Scott Winship, Angela Rashidi, and Matt Weininger, are doing exceptional work on these subjects. So I'm grateful for the ability to speak with Senator Romney about this proposal, and I hope to give him the perspective of someone who has worked in a local Department of Social Services. After our conversation, there will be some time for Senator Romney to take questions from the audience, and afterwards we will hear from an excellent panel of Washington's best scholars who work on family formation and prosperity. So thank you all for coming, and Senator Romney, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert, and it's delightful to be here at AEI. Appreciate the work that you do and the ideas that you provide. I also have to acknowledge that in developing this plan that my team has worked with a number of scholars here at AEI and so our other institutions here in DC to get ideas and suggestions, so appreciate that work. Before we actually get into our proposal, I want to spend a little time talking about how we got here and give a bit of the history, if you will, of the Family Security Act. It was, 26 years ago when President Bill Clinton signed a law which ended welfare as we know it. You know that story, of course. It was designed to end some of the New Deal policies that had trapped people into poverty. And it was largely successful. Teen pregnancy plummeted, welfare rolls declined, poverty rates fell below the levels that existed before that had been put in place. Now, in the 21st century, we face some different challenges, not just for welfare recipients and those that are locked into poverty, but for the American family itself. Marriage rates are declining in our country. Birth rates are declining in our country. And throughout government, it seems that federal policies exist that unintentionally discourage creating marriages, having families, basically creating a strong family unit. And of course, that's essential to the success of children in our society. Now, choosing whether or not to have a child is, of course, part of a very complex and personal decision process with a lot of factors to consider. But one of those factors to consider is the economics associated with having a child, because there's a growing gap that's been seen between the number of children people say they want to have and the number they actually decide to have. So just to be clear here, I don't think the federal government's policy should be to try and create incentives to have people have more children than they want, but instead should find a way to bridge the gap between what people would like to have for their family and what they're able to afford. So to begin with, of course, family policies ought to encourage people to get married. That I do think is something which is a positive, and basically remove the penalties that exist if you do get married. And until very recent years, of course, that was a bipartisan talking point. In 1994, Bill Clinton said during his State of the Union address this, he said, "We cannot renew our country when within a decade, more than half the children will be born into families where there has been no marriage. At the time, of course, 22% of mothers aged 25 to 29 were single. Fast forward to 2008, then Senator Obama said this: if we're honest with ourselves, we'll admit that too many fathers are missing from too many lives and too many homes. They've abandoned their responsibilities, acting like boys instead of men. Now, when President Obama gave that speech, some 33% of mothers ages 25 to 29 would be single, 11% higher than when President Clinton was in office. And that number today is 40% and going higher. So despite these worthy ambitions of former presidents, I'm concerned that marriage, the foundation of our families, is even weaker still. And unfortunately, the decline in marriage is even more pronounced among low-income families than it is among other families. As a matter of fact, 60% of upper-income adults are married, but only 20% of low-income adults are married. And that shift over the last 50 years is in no small measure the result of federal policies which make it harder for low-income families to marry. In some respects, it reminds me of the shadow of welfare, which welfare and the way we had our welfare system prior to welfare reform was it locked people into generational poverty. It was pointed out a number of times by a number of people that the highest marginal tax rate in America during the time of welfare was at a time when people were on welfare, and if they were poor, and if they wanted to get a job, every dollar they earned would result in a reduction dollar for dollar of what they were receiving in welfare benefits. So the tax rate was effectively 100% for going to work. Well, in some respects, that same phenomenon exists with regards to marriage. If a young woman is living in poverty, happens to be pregnant, and decides to marry, she's far less likely to qualify for Medicaid, housing vouchers, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and a lot more. And the best way she can get support for her child is making sure she doesn't get married. And as a result, not surprisingly, a lot of people who are in poverty decide not to get married. It's the same kind of phenomenon we've seen before. Now, in addition to discouraging marriage, our programs are really not doing enough to help expectant moms. One survey showed that the majority of women who choose to have an abortion did so because they were fearful that they would not be able to afford the cost of having a child. Think about that. So our policies are doing two things. One, they're encouraging people not to get married. And number two, they're making it more difficult to decide to have a child that you might otherwise want to bring into the earth. Now, let's look at an example, and I'm just going to focus on the Earned Income Tax Credit. Let's say a young woman finds out this summer that she's expecting her first child. I'll assume that she's working part-time and earning about $15,000 a year. She'd be eligible for about $3,600 in the Earned Income Tax Credit. And yet the Earned Income Tax Credit is not going to give her a dollar to help pay for transportation, going to the doctor, not going to help her get a crib and stroller and even a car seat, all right? Because that's not going to happen for quite some time. She won't get her $3,600 until the spring of 2024, after the baby is nearly a year old. So think about that. For this young mom, it is a daunting financial hit. To become pregnant, to have a child, you're not going to get help from the Earned Income Tax Credit until at least your child is a year old. Now, to address the concerns with regards both to family formation, marriage, and the desire to help people who want to have a child be able to do so, along with Richard Burr and Steve Daines, we released a plan last month which we call the Family Security Act 2.0. 1.0 had some things which people pointed out, said that'll never pass, can't happen, so we put that aside, learned from the comments we received from Robert and others, and said, okay, let's try 2.0 and see if it's a little better. And by the way, let me note here, you see 3 Republican names. For this to become law, we're going to have some Democrat names. And that means we're going to have a bipartisan negotiation. It will change again. There's some things in it I know the Democrats will find unacceptable. And we're willing to negotiate and see if we can find some common ground. But I want to lay out the principles that we put in place because I think in many cases they will remain and they're essential. Under our plan, the same expectant mother that I described in that example will start getting $700 a month in her 5th month of pregnancy. So she's going to have some funding to make sure she can outfit her home for the child that she'll be bringing into the world, also being able to make doctor's visits, paying whatever copay she may have on pharmaceuticals that she may need, and so forth. Once the baby is born, she will get $350 per month per child, and upon reaching school age, that number goes down to $250 per month. Now, in order to be eligible for the full benefit of that $700, $350, and $250, the family income has to be at least $10,000. If the family income is less than $2,000, why the benefit is reduced proportionately. But once you get $10,000, that's the amount. $10,000 or above. Doesn't make any difference how much above you get. The numbers remain the same. Now, as you can tell, there's an incentive in this to get married, because it's $10,000 per household. So that means, if your spouse or if your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever is earning money and you're earning money, coming together makes it more likely you'll get to the $10,000 minimum, you'll be able to get the full benefit. So it encourages marriage as opposed to discouraging marriage. And of course, the $10,000 figure is designed to be attainable. We're not talking about a really, really high level of income, of course. And it's pretty simple for people to understand. They're going to be able to navigate receiving this benefit on a pretty straightforward basis. Now, I'd also note that this is fully paid for. And that will be an essential ingredient of this plan, or we won't go forward with negotiations with our Democrat friends on anything else. How do we do that? Well, we take 2 current programs and either change them or collapse them entirely. So the child tax credit we collapse and use it to fund this program, and the family portion of the earned income tax credit likewise is adjusted to pay for this plan. And that's where about $160 billion of the total funding comes from. It comes from those 2 programs. So we get rid of programs and instead fund something that works better, that's simpler, that's easier to administer, easier to understand, comes to people at a time that they need it. And so I think a very substantial improvement of what we have. Now, right now, of course, under the current plan, if you want to get the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit, you've got to hire a tax preparer, most likely, to help you do the calculation to see if you qualify. And that's going to cost a few $100s. There are a lot of people who, actually 1/4 of the people in this country who qualify for child tax credits and earned income tax credit, 1/4 of the people that qualify for it don't know it and don't get it, because they don't know how to they don't know how to file the taxes and get the information that they need to be able to receive that benefit. I mean, really, their current system really doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, I know that the more progressive of my friends are not going to like this, because the more progressive of my friends, anytime there's a need, instead of saying, what programs do we currently have that we could eliminate or adjust and allow them to pay for a better program, instead their thought is, well, let's just create a new one and add more money to all of them. I mean, and that is the approach Washington has taken time and time again. It's resulted in a morass of programs which are highly ineffective and in some respects are counterproductive. And I can rattle off a list of some of those. I wrote them down. There's $120 billion that we spend on the child tax credit, $16 billion for TANF, $4 billion for child independent care tax credit, $27 billion for SNAP, $70 billion for the earned income tax credit. Section 8 housing, of course, is also available, CHIP, Head Start, WIC. I mean, it's a mind-numbing list of programs for a per person, a new pregnant mom to navigate. It's expensive for the government. In some respects, it creates incentives that are counter to our national interest. Administratively, it's massive. I mean, think of all the people it takes to administer all these programs. And of course, I presume there's ample opportunity for gaming the system or even defrauding it in one way or another. And the message that it sends to to a young mom or to a young couple is that the government is confused, that it doesn't know how to help you. Our design is to see if we can't have a message that's pretty straightforward, which is if you're pregnant, we're going to be able to help you with your expenses. And if you have a child, from day one, you're going to be able to get a monthly check. And that funding will be able to use to buy clothing, to buy food, and so forth. And you'll be able to care for this child and won't have to worry about the unaffordability of doing so. So it's been, 26 years since welfare reform. And I know many people here were very much involved in that, and I congratulate you for that. That happened when there was a Democrat in the White House and Republicans in Congress. There are some who predict that we'll be seeing the same thing for the next couple of years, and it may present an opportunity for us to do something of the nature I've described. So, in my opinion, as we look at these programs, and this is, by the way, I don't pretend like our act solves all the issues I've described and resolves all the morass of government programs. It doesn't, but it takes on a couple of them and makes them work better, reduces some of the disincentives towards marriage, allows people to be able to have a child if they feel they want to have a child and will know that they can financially afford doing so. And so it sends a very strong message that we care about families, we care about helping people who decide to have a family. I think it's a pro-marriage, pro-work, pro-family approach, and hope that it can become, if you will, a bit of a rallying cry for those of us on the right, and hopefully for our friends on the left as well, to say, hey, let's rethink how we're doing things and see if we can't do a better job for the American family. Thanks.
Very good. So thank you a lot, Senator Romney. That was a great summary of your proposal. And again, I want to say how honored we are that you came here to discuss it. I want to take you through a couple little aspects of the proposal that
I was afraid of that.
have raised some concerns. And I'm going to start with the easiest one and move to the harder as I go, if that's okay with you, or at least that's how I view them. So the benefit that you propose will go to single mothers or single parent households up to $200,000 in income, and to married parents up to $400,000 in income. Now, why do you think we need to provide additional federal assistance to families at that high level of income?
A couple things. First of all, it's designed to be a family policy. It's designed to help family formation and people want to have kids, all right? It's not designed to be an anti-poverty program. It's not a poverty program. It's a family program. And I know our Democrat friends are more inclined to always think about poverty. How do we get more money to the poor? And this helps poor families, but it helps middle-income families as well. And so we want to encourage or take away the disincentive for marriage that exists for middle income as well as lower income. At the same time, I'll note, one reason for those figures is that that's what the current plan provides. The current law has the 200, 400 limit, and so rather than coming up with a new limit and trying to explain to our friends, oh, we've changed the number for this reason, we said, okay, we'll use the numbers that are there now for EITC and child tax credit. I can tell you, I would expect my Democrat friends are going to want to negotiate on this very point. And rather than giving them any ground at this stage, I'm keeping that in my pocket for negotiations down the road.
So if someone calls it a creation of a new middle-class entitlement, you would say, yeah, that's probably what it is.
I'd say, no, I'm not going to call it an entitlement so much as saying we want to help people recognize that there's not a disincentive to get married, and number two, we'll help you have children if you want to have children. If that number comes down, if the income level comes down, I'm not going to cry about that. But what the right number is open for negotiation.
Now, I want you to know that all of us here in this room, as you can see by the crowd, view you as, one of the most important senators in the United States Senate. But another senator in the United States Senate who appears to be quite important too, Joe Manchin, had raised some objectives.
Particularly this morning, yeah.
He had some concerns that he expressed about the Biden administration's child tax credit proposal. And one of them was around work. And why do you think this will not add to the amount of dollars that go to families who work either not at all or a little and provide an incentive for them not to work more or to even join the labor force? Why isn't this another work disincentive?
Yeah, well, actually, Joe Manchin's objections were one of the reasons we made the change from going from 1.0 to 2.0. I met with him, and I've met with a number of Democrats, by the way. We haven't begun the bipartisan negotiations on this until BBB is gone, because they feel, understandably, that they don't want to be negotiating with us on a plan which is contrary to what the president put forward until that's gone. But I have been working with a number of Democrats quietly behind the scenes, and he said, Mitt, he said, in our original plan, there was no income required at all. Everybody got these checks. Mm-hmm. And he said, you could have a setting where it could be seen that someone has one child after another. They have 5 kids, perhaps, and they're getting all these checks, and basically they live off of government. And you've created, if you will, a welfare plan again, where people are not required to work. He said, there's got to be some work requirement. And I agreed with him and said, I understand that. I at the same time, I'd like people, a young woman that's not working and is pregnant, I'd like her to know that she doesn't have to eliminate the pregnancy to be able to carry the financial burden of a child. But I understand that we don't want to create any potential incentive for people to become entirely dependent upon government, and to have children not as a source of fulfilling their desire to have a child, but instead of as a source of income. And so we basically say, look, let's get a number which is relatively easy to attain, $10,000 annual household income. And if you reach that, you get the benefits. But if you're not earning anything, you're not going to get these benefits. And if you're earning $5,000 a year, well, you'll get half the amount.
Right. So it scales in at the first dollar.
Yeah.
And households that earn very little get some. When they get to $10,000, they get the maximum benefit.
Yeah.
It goes up for a period and then it phases out. So there is at least a work expectation that you have to work a little.
Yeah.
As shown by the IRS tax return you filed the previous year.
Yeah. And there are some proposals which I understand that say, look, we want to give you an incentive to work, so we're going to give you a bigger benefit the more you work. All right,
which is what this does.
Yeah, which is, and I mean up to $10,000. After that, look, it's the same.
Yeah.
I believe that we want to get help to people to have to feel that they can afford to get married and can afford to have a child, and the incentive to go work more than $10,000. That's already as part of the current earned income tax credit program, and that will remain.
So another aspect that has come up is the extent to which this is kind of an increased federalization of benefit programs to struggling families, that you're sending a check from Washington on a monthly basis, you intend to use the Social Security Administration to administer it, and the local departments of social services, the states, the cities, that see individuals, single moms with kids who come in and apply, and you sort of disparage the programs, but some people who work in those programs think that they're helping them get to work, or they're getting them food assistance, or they're getting them attached to the EITC in their own way. Are you concerned as a conservative about the bringing into Washington this responsibility and the elimination of the groups that are closer to the people, and the people that will actually see, especially at the bottom, the people who will actually interact in a human way with the single parents or the struggling parents that are in the condition they're in for reasons that aren't able to be seen here in Washington, but would be seen at the local level?
Well, and as you know, one of the reasons we made a change from 1.0 to 2.0 was a recognition of those who said programs like TANF allow people at the local level to actually work on some of the root causes of poverty and other problems that people have. And we were going to, in 1.0, we were eliminating TANF. Was it what, 16 billion or so? We were eliminating TANF to help pay for this.
Yeah.
And we heard from you and others saying, TANF doesn't work everywhere, but in some states it works pretty well. And you probably don't want to eliminate that. So we made some adjustments. So we didn't eliminate TANF. So the state continues to run all the programs that are directly related to individuals that are getting help and need care. But the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, those are federally administered now. That's tax law. That's the IRS. And so we're not grabbing something that's at the state level and pulling it to the federal level. It's already federal. But instead of having the IRS administer it, we're saying, look, let's have the Social Security Administration do so. And they're better equipped at sending out checks, which they do for a lot of people already. Number two, I don't know how many people have had a child here recently. It's been a while for me, but I understand that when you have a child, I mean, someone comes to the hospital and you get a Social Security number right there. I mean, you're assigned a Social Security number when the child is in the hospital. So we'll have that number at that stage. So the Social Security Administration has the information to be able to provide the checks administratively, and the contact, the person-to-person contact, which is often very helpful, continues at the state level.
I'm going to just press you a little bit on that, because one of the reasons that the person-to-person contact happens is because the person in need needs to get some assistance. And if the assistance is provided, it may lead them to be less likely to seek the counseling or guidance that they could get from one of these programs. And so, you know, there's a concern that money from Washington will make it so it's unnecessary for them to go and see a social services worker and talk about a substance abuse problem or support from the absent parent. Does that concern you at all?
Well, there's no question, but I intend and would anticipate that these people will continue to seek those services, but in part because I gave you that laundry list of the programs that they are qualified for,
right,
if they're in poverty, whether it's housing vouchers, food stamps, the WIC program, CHIPS. I mean, there are all these various programs that people qualify for, and it's our expectation they'll continue to do so. So taking a tax benefit today, which is provided by the IRS, and moving it to the state level, I think would open up a burden on states, which could be pretty substantial. I'd also note this, and it's in the back of my mind. I don't know how significant it is, but we just had, as you know, with the COVID relief plans, a very substantial amount of money that went out for unemployment insurance. A massive amount of that turns out to have been fraudulently provided by the states. That there are a lot of states that just don't know how to distribute money in a non-fraudulent manner. And
Senator Romney,
so
wait a minute. That money went out from the federal government as part of a federal program.
It was a federal program administered by the states.
Yeah.
And the states sent those checks out to all sorts of people who shouldn't have gotten it. So the idea, our idea is the Social Security Administration has done a pretty good job at being able to send money to people who are legitimately qualified for the program. So we're that's true. The Social Security does do a very good job of sending money out the door and getting it to the people that should get it. Yeah.
They don't do really anything on helping people get into work who are disabled or want to work or have mental illness issues.
AEI is going to have to solve the problem you're describing.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I've got I'm going to go to questions from the audience in just a second, and then we have the panel discussion after. You talked quite a lot about marriage, and that is an issue that's very important, and I've worked on that issue for a long time. You're absolutely right. We need to do more about marriage. Children do just enormously better in married two-parent families, and we want to encourage that. And what you've done here is eliminate the penalty for marriage. But did you consider providing a more generous benefit to married, or maybe only providing the benefit to married families?
Did I consider it? Yeah. No. Should I? I'm not sure. As I described, what we have done is said, you've got to reach an income level of at least $10,000, and whether that's you singly or with a spouse. So we have made it a lot easier to hit the maximum amount if you're married. So we have created I believe, a very substantial marriage benefit, marriage incentive, by virtue of the way we've structured the program. Do you provide even more if they're married? Well, a higher benefit. I'm not sure a higher benefit is called for, but we've created this incentive. And by the way, if in looking at it, we see that the marriage numbers haven't changed, particularly for low-income people, as much as we'd like, we can adjust that.
Yeah, because a large portion of the benefit to the people at the bottom of this program will go to single-parent families, without question.
Yeah.
And there's no real connection in this program to the absent parent who should also be providing in the way there is in TANF. That raises another last question about the ITC, and I'm just going to, is that the 75% number of getting the ITC is because a lot of single childless adults don't get the ITC. Among parents, the take-up rate of the ITC is much, much higher because they're not stupid. It's a very generous program, and it provides a lot of aid.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and by the way, I mean, I'd like to see people get married. There's no question that's a better setting in which to raise a child. Study after study has shown that, and our own personal experience has shown that. At the same time, if a single mom doesn't feel she wants to marry the person that got her pregnant, and she's making a decision as to whether or not to keep the child, I want her to know that she has the capacity to keep the child, and that she'll have the financial wherewithal to be able to bring the child into the world and to keep the child.
I'm sure, as do I, 100%, 100%. But you also want the other parent, if they can, to provide some support to the family.
No question.
The more likely they pay support, the more likely they are to provide emotional aid. There's that as well.
No question.
Okay, let's open it up to the audience and see where the questions are. Come on, guys. It's got to be a good one. It's right there in the back, right by the microphone. Perfect.
Hi, Senator Romney.
Hi.
My name is Josh Protas. I'm with Mazon, a Jewish Response to Hunger. And here, clearly, the emphasis of your proposal as a marriage program, not an anti-poverty program. The right to marriage now is in jeopardy for many Americans. So with the emphasis on ensuring marriage and family formation, will you be supportive of guaranteeing the federal right for same-sex marriage?
I'm looking at the bill that's come from the House, and we've had some pretty substantial discussions about what the implications might be of that legislation on on religious freedom and the practice of religion, and there are differing points of view on that, and so we're digging into that and looking to see whether two things could be dealt with. One is looking at the provision of protection for religious practice, religious freedom. And the other is to make sure that this act does not in any way open the door to polygamy or other practices that would not be acceptable. There's I think it's the Title IV of the bill that seems to, does not indicate that this applies only to two people. And so we're looking for adjustments on those topics, and if we receive those, that'll be a different calculation. Thank you.
Okay, right there.
Thank you, Senator Romney. I'm Michael Leeser with the Family Foundation of Virginia. The Susan B. Anthony List has put together her plan, Pregnancy Life and Assistance Network in various states, Mississippi, West Virginia, Georgia, and Virginia. Basically an exhaustive collection of pregnancy resource centers, other social service groups that provide for employment and child care protection as well and services. Is there anything that Congress could do to help support or incentivize support for programs like that, especially in a post-Dobbs landscape?
Well, there's no question that there are things Congress could do. The question is, would Congress act in that regard? In part because the nation is divided on this topic, and so is Congress. And at the same time, finding ways to help people who are pregnant be able to make a decision which is consistent with their personal desires, as opposed to the requirements of, let's say, economics, is part of what we're attempting to do in the bill, in this Family Security Act. But I applaud the work and happy to look at some options that might be available to us.
Senator, just to follow up on that a little bit, you've made a reference to a decision concerning completing the term of a pregnancy a couple times in this presentation. Is this proposal related to the Dobbs decision?
Not really. I mean, all things relate to children and in that regard. But we put this plan together before the Dobbs decision was reached. Didn't know it was coming. Didn't expect it to be coming. This was designed to help people be able to have a child if they want to. And I think for someone who is contemplating an abortion, actually, whether or not Dobbs was there, whether they're contemplating an abortion because they don't think they can afford to have a child,
Yeah.
we're saying this is there to help people make a decision based on being able to afford. And at that point, the decision is theirs. And so we're helping out in that regard. But I think, by the way, I think for those of us that are pro-life, as I am, and who applaud the Dobbs decision, as I do, I think this is saying, by the way, we're there to help, and we're mindful of families. We're not just an anti-poverty movement. We're a pro-family movement, and we can show that not by just saying we don't want to have pregnancies ended, but also because we're willing to compensate people who become pregnant, pay $700 a month, and compensate for each child that people have. And this shows our bona fides when it comes to our commitment to children and to families.
Okay. Yes, this woman right here.
Hi, Senator Romney.
Wait for the mic. Wait for the mic.
Hi there.
Hi, my name's Kavya. I'm a college student and an intern here in DC. So, as a member of Generation Z, something I've been able to observe is kind of the struggles of the millennial generation in terms of paying back their loans, struggling with starting families. So, as a proponent of legislation like this, I'm curious what different outcomes you can hope for my generation in the next 10 to 20 years as, people of my age move into making these decisions. And then the second part of my question is, as we're in this kind of post-COVID economy, I think something we've been able to observe is the sort of tight labor market. So I'm curious about your thoughts on getting Americans back to work and maybe what parts of this legislation may help in that push. Thanks.
Two-part there.
Yeah. Well,
Millennials and labor
I'll
force.
start with your generation, which is, I think it's time for my generation to get off the stage.
Are you referring about presidential candidates?
I am. There are far too many boomers around. Is this a time for my joke?
Yes, use it.
Let's see. How did that go? It's, which version, right? Which is the last words I heard from my grandfather. Stop shaking the ladder, you little jerk. So we're on the ladder, all right? And it's time for you guys to start shaking it. And my view is the next generation has to say, look, we're concerned about the country and where this country's going. I happen to think there are a number of major challenges we face that, interestingly, we're not doing much on. We do things at the edges, but in terms of really addressing them, we're not doing. I mean, one is China is going to surpass the United States as the largest economy in the world, with the biggest military, and potentially the geopolitical leader of the world, just by virtue of the population it has and the law of demographics, all right? So how do we deal with that? How do we divert them? How do we, one, keep that from happening, or number two, divert them to be less malevolent? That's number one. Number two, how much debt do we have as a country? And we keep on talking about the budget, the portion of the budget we vote on, which is 1/3 of federal spending. How about the 2/3? Why don't we talk about that? No one I mean, President Trump, when he was running for office, not going to look at any of those entitlement programs. Same thing with George W. Bush was the last one that proposed something and didn't go anywhere. Climate change, I believe, is another. And I think that the decline of our families is another, which is the idea that we're marrying later and later or not at all and having fewer and fewer kids. That's kind of hard for our civilization, our nation to be able to sustain itself. So these are things I think we need to address. This Family Security Act takes on one of them. So my encouragement to people of your generation and those that are not boomers is to get more involved in politics, to vote more regularly, to work on campaigns, to get your friends to get involved in campaigns, and to make sure that the people who are running for office respond to the concerns that you have. Unfortunately, elected officials overwhelmingly respond to the concerns they're hearing from voters, and what they're hearing from voters typically are short-term things, and there's some long-term issues we need to address.
Okay, one last question, right here. I was going to say that maybe you'd also recommend that the millennials get married and have children.
Oh, yeah.
That's what I say to my children.
Yeah.
A student and also an intern here in DC this summer. I really like this legislation, but it seems like it focuses really heavily on just the women and encourages the women to keep the child, the women to work. Do you think there's any part of your legislation, or maybe you can tweak the legislation to also encourage the men to step up and take responsibility? Because it seems like that's actually the problem that's affecting these families.
Yeah, I think, by the way, that's one of the things that I think Senator Rubio has proposed, which makes a good deal of sense, which is to incentivize the father to provide for the child. The idea that we provide benefits to a single mom without the father providing any support whatsoever doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And what his program cuts off? What is it, Stephen? It cuts off
It's on child support.
on child support, but
There's the Utah. Remember the new law Utah?
yeah. But what is it? What does the Utah law cut off? Do you recall? Is it?
Hunting and fishing license.
Oh, that's it. That was it. I just learned yesterday from Stephen Newton, who's, by the way, who's the author of this plan. Stephen Newton reminded me of a law passed in Utah, which is absolutely fascinating, which is if a father is behind in child support in Utah, he can't get a hunting or fishing license. Now,
That's an incentive to support your children.
Interestingly, believe it or not, the number of people behind in child support has dropped dramatically. All right? And so yeah, there are, we can think about creative ways. I'm not sure hunting and fishing licenses will be as powerful in New York City as they are in Utah. But in Utah, you need a deer hunting license or you're not a real man. And so there may be some ways to tie things that men want to actually providing child support, but also providing for their child, even if it's not child support and they're not married, providing for the child.
Oh, sure.
If you bring a child into the world, you should have responsibility for that, for the financing of that child just as much as the mom.
Okay, I want all of us to thank Senator Romney for this wonderful presentation. And stay seated while you leave.
All right.
Is that okay? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to get started. We've got a limited amount of time, so I want to make sure we have as great a conversation up here as we can. My name is Scott Winship. I'm the Director of Poverty Studies here at AEI. Notwithstanding Senator Romney's point that the Family Security Act is both family policy and anti-poverty policy, because we're poverty studies, and a lot of the expertise of folks up here is around poverty. We'll probably focus a little bit more on that than family policy generally, but we'll probably touch on both. In that regard, I'd want to say that I think improving the lives of low-income families with children should be a bipartisan priority. It's definitely the case for us at AEI, and want to thank Senator Romney and his team for their leadership on this issue. Promise we won't talk about whether we have entered a recession an hour and 15 minutes ago. Do not ask questions about that. I will make you lose your turn. And with that, I'll just launch into some very quick introductions so that we can really get into sort of a meaty conversation. Starting immediately to my right is Robert Rector, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Robert's been a giant of anti-poverty policy for 30 years now. Next is Angela Rashidi. She's my colleague here at AEI, Senior Fellow and the Rose Scholar of Poverty Studies. Before that, she was quite high up in New York City's Department of Social Services. To her right is, literally to her right, probably not philosophically, is Elaine Mogg, Senior Fellow at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center at the Urban Institute. Prior to that, Elaine was previously at the IRS. And then finally, Patrick Brown, who's a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Before that, he was at the Joint Economic Committee working on the Social Capital Project. And it says here, I'm reading my notes, for the best boss ever. That's, not sure who put that in there. With that, let me start off a conversation. So focusing first on the Family Security Act, and I think Senator Romney gave a great overview of the provisions of that. Senator Romney's original proposal, probably the biggest change, the original proposal last year would have provided the full expanded child tax credit to everyone, regardless of if the parents had any tax liability or whether they had any earnings, whereas the current version phases in until a family has $10,000 in earnings. There's definitely some other changes as well, but that's probably the biggest one. So the first question for everyone, how should policymakers weight the issue of work and marriage incentives versus providing immediate support to the lowest income families? Should we, another way to put this is, should we just have a child allowance, which is what a lot of the conversation was around last year? So let me just start with you, Angela, on this question.
Sure, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, we've kind of decided as a country, at least in the last century, that for low-income families as a country, we are going to, or we want to provide assistance to help low-income families meet their material needs. So policymakers, though, have to grapple with unintended consequences of providing assistance. And certainly, history has shown us that some of those unintended consequences are reduced marriage and reduced employment. So Senator Romney talked a lot about marriage, and I think he's exactly right that policy should at least not disincentivize marriage. He talked a little bit less about employment, and I think from my perspective, employment really is the key. So to answer in brief the answer to your question is yes, I think employment is crucial, not only in family policy, but also in anti-poverty policy. And the reason it's crucial is what we have learned over the past 30 plus years in safety net policy in this country. With the welfare reforms in the 1990s, it became very clear from an evidence-based perspective, as well as just a value perspective, that employment is the cornerstone to reducing poverty. It offers one of the clearest paths out of poverty. So to the extent that the federal government is reforming policy or enacting new policies, employment and really figuring out how to not disincentivize employment must be key.
Great, thanks. Elaine, how do you sort of think about the trade-offs involved, or whether there are trade-offs involved?
So there's certainly trade-offs involved, but I think we could have a more nuanced conversation. We should think about when we provide this basic support to families and people can count on it. We see in survey data that sometimes they use it to attain more education. So should we be excluding them from child policy? I don't think so. Sometimes grandparents are caregiving. Sometimes people are disabled, unable to work. I don't think we should just leave them out. There's also, people use that money to pay for childcare, which can enable work. So it's not, just a one-way thing. Will some people not work because of a child allowance? I think every economist would agree. I think we're debating, what the margin is and whether that's the most important thing to think about. I also think if we're going to think about these issues broadly, then can we change the definition of work a little bit? Do we have to rely on last year's work? Could we rely on, a couple years back, last year, this year? Should we be thinking about other activities, caregiving being one of them, and education being another, that maybe ought to be considered work in this context of subsidizing families? We also, and this last thing I'll say, Michael Cartman and I recently did some work where we looked at folks who got the child tax credit in those last 6 months of the year, and folks who didn't. And we looked then at their employment rates. We looked a year ago, and then in December, so 2 Decembers apart, and we don't see a difference. And so it looked to us like at least under the last iteration of the child tax credit, folks were just as likely to go to work if they'd been receiving the credit as if they hadn't.
Robert, you don't have views on this topic? Or do you?
I have a few views on this topic. What the so-called child allowance is essentially the reversal of welfare reform and everything that welfare reform accomplished. The majority of Democrats opposed welfare reform in 1996, the progressive wing, and they've wanted to restore what was effectively aid to families with dependent children ever since then for 25 years. But they can't use that name, so they come up with a version that's very much like this. This is essentially giving $4,000 or $5,000 of cash to non-married women that don't work. That is the old AFDC system. Okay, so if you thought that was a good system, then boy, let's do that. But let me go over what welfare reform did. Welfare reform cut child poverty among single-parent families, which had remained flat or growing for decades, cut it in half. The percentage of children that were living in married 2-parent families had been going down like this. It flattens out, okay? And it's complicated, but that's what it does. The birth rate of non-married women, which had been doing this, kind of flattens out after that. All of those things are hugely structured, but the one that's most representative of this is non-married teen births, okay, which almost all teen births are non-married, so teen births basically. In the decades before welfare reform, that went up about 3.5-fold. It's like a rocket going up. And when we did welfare reform, even the Washington Post was writing books about children who want to have children. Okay, everyone knew this was a disaster. Welfare reform comes in, and it is bipartisan in the sense that Bill Clinton was out there articulating this marriage. This line is going this, it comes right straight down. It's like an isosceles triangle. It's remarkable, a remarkable social achievement, okay? So do you really want to go back to the old system, which was to offer to a 15-year-old that if you have a baby now, we're going to give you $3,000 or $4,000 a year for the next 18 years, because we know how they respond to that, okay? It's an absolute social disaster, but that's in fact what this would be done. A work requirement is in fact a pro-marriage requirement. What you see was when we replaced AFTC with temporary assistance to needy families, the key thing is time limits. You don't get this benefit forever, or at least nominally you don't. And there is a work requirement attached to it. You cannot get the benefit indefinitely without doing something to at least prepare for work. What happened when we did that was the caseload dropped about 80% immediately, and the child poverty rate went down at the same time. It's an amazing effect that people have kind of forgotten this, and it's just baffles me that anyone would be talking about going back to that older system. But also it affected the birth rate of non-married women, and it affects the abortion rate, which it brought it down, and we'll get into that later. But it's very, very effective. What you got from welfare reform was a drop in child poverty, a drop in pure welfare dependence, a surge in employment among never married, low-educated women, who were the principal group that we were concerned with. And you had abortions be more or less stabilized, and non-marital pregnancies largely stabilized. All of this happening very dramatically. When you look, I have a paper coming out on this. You don't see this very often, but all of these lines, they just kink. They kink right at the welfare reform point, and then there's a huge change in the vector. All of it is positive. All of it is what you would expect. But boy, if you want to ruin everything, then please go back to just saying to an unmarried young woman, have a baby, no work requirement, you get it for 18 years, cash, here you go. You want a disaster? Everyone knew that AFDC was a disaster when we got rid of it. This is a way to essentially restore that system.
I think the share of kids living with a single parent also stopped falling for the kids with the lowest educated parents. And it kept falling for kids with higher educated parents around that same time, another inflection point. Patrick, any thoughts from you on the policy itself or the politics around it?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the senator kind of gave pretty much everything I would want to say in support of the policy. I think it's a really salutary contribution, especially coming from somebody on the right. And I think it opens up a really unique political moment, as he gestured to. The initial child tax credit was signed into law under President Clinton with the Republican Congress. And so I think the addition of the work requirement or the income requirement in FSA 2.0 addresses the biggest, I think, political vulnerability of the original version, which Robert just spent some time going into. And I think if you look at the polling, we did some focus groups around the time that the first payments were coming out last summer. And there was really a sense, even among the population that was directly benefiting from receiving the expanded CTC, there was a sense that they were concerned about a lack of reciprocity, and they were concerned about their neighbor down the street who was going to be living off the dole and this sort of thing. And so having that sense of having a skin in the game and having a sense of social insurance, as our friends over at American Compass will talk about, the idea that you're sort of paying into the system by having some modest threshold at which you need to hit, and then your consumption smoothing across the life course, right? Because we know that parents experience a hit to their earnings, especially moms, and so allowing the tax code to supplement, I think, is it has a potential to reach across the aisle in a unique way. And so, obviously, the senator talked about some of the negotiating lines that he's open to sort of thinking about. I think one that would be some low-hanging fruit for our friends across the aisle would be to look at the first year and maybe making that universal, recognizing that moms, especially when they give birth and they have a recovery period and that sort of thing, maybe making that first year of life available to all parents, and then kicking in that income threshold. I think there's a lot of room to negotiate, but I think that basic principle, and this is something that I was kind of convinced of, whether the first Romney proposal came out, I like the universality of it. I thought it had a lot to recommend it, but I think the public opinion just isn't there. We saw this in response to the Biden plan, especially. And so having a work requirement or an income threshold allows for a broader buy-in across the political spectrum. I think that's a good thing to be pushing forward on.
Scott, can I just add, or I think re-emphasize something Robert said, and also just kind of provide a bigger context. I think we too often in the discussions about the child tax credit under the temporary expansion and even this is we think of it in isolation when really it is part of a much larger safety net for low-income populations. And so we may not see employment changes in the short term because of the CTC, because people maybe they don't change their behavior based on a short-term policy, and also maybe it isn't enough money to change behavior. But when you add that on top of existing SNAP benefits, which we know also have employment disincentives, if somebody is fortunate enough to get housing vouchers, that has a huge employment disincentive. So you start layering on all of these benefits, and that's where we start to see a shift away from what Robert was talking about, this huge gain in the 1990s, shifting our safety net from one that was built on government dependency towards employment. And I'm also concerned that this one policy, maybe this one change, could be an inflection point, and we start to revert back to a safety net that doesn't hold employment and marriage as kind of the cornerstone of the safety net. So I think for me, it is a bigger issue than just this one particular policy.
If I could just add, the 1996 welfare reform was designed to promote work and marriage. A lot of people see it as just employment. And I think actually some of its most profound effects were in marriage. The other thing is, as you were saying, Pat, roughly, we run a poll recurringly, but about 90% of the American public, including about 90% of Democrats, believe that an able-bodied adult who receives cash, food, or housing or medical care from the government should be required to work or at least prepare for work. They don't want to generate a class of purely dependent people, which is what the old AFDC system did, where you had basically 1 in 7 children enrolled in that program for up to 14 years, and it was just an absolute disaster. You don't want to in any way encourage that. And I would say, if you wanted to give this for 1 year, the people we're dealing with have very short time horizons. So do you really want to say to a 15-year-old, here's $4,000 cash? That is not an incentive. Plus, this is a huge system. We spend $527 billion a year on means-tested programs, cash, food, housing, and medical care for lower-income families with kids. That comes to about $50,000 for each family with a pre-welfare earnings below 200% of poverty. It's a massive amount of system. We couldn't even sit up here and itemize how many programs are in this. And most of the discussions basically ignore most of what's already out there.
So I'm sensitive of time. We could spend the rest of the panel, I think, talking about FSA and these issues generally. I sort of want to move us to the more general topic of tax policy and how that affects families. We've got tax credits that incentivize parenthood, tax credits that encourage or discourage marriage, tax credits that can encourage or discourage work or stay-at-home parenting. Lots of other tax policy provisions influence these decisions too. How should, if at all, how should tax policy seek to influence family-related decisions? And if there are ways you think that it could do it better to the extent you want it to do it, what might those be? Let's start with Elaine on this one.
So I would really like to see tax policy that people can understand. So you would simplify it. Angela's written about this. Probably everyone has. There's a work incentive, that's the earned income tax credit. That's going to stick around. No one's questioning that. There's a child tax credit that could be turned into a child support policy. And I would love to see the two truly separated. And that's one thing Romney does. I'm not super keen on reducing the EITC benefit, which ends up making, I think, 8 to 10 million children actually worse off after the policy. But if that were kept at a substantial level, we get this work incentive. People are clear about that. We get the child benefit. When we did work with TANF recipients, we asked them about how they perceive their benefits and work. If you go work more, what's going to happen? And people do not understand what's happening in the tax system broadly. That's a failure on policy, and it also makes it difficult for people to engage, and it makes it more complicated to administer. That's another reason why we might think about a child credit being sort of separated and just a child benefit without a lot of hoops to jump through. People can count on it. And, using one of Senator Romney's phrases, people will stop shaking the ladder beneath parents.
Patrick, I want to ask you, as someone who I think, to the extent we place folks within buckets these days on the center right, would be considered sort of one of the social conservatives, perhaps new right adjacent, if not comfortably new right.
Some have accused me of such. Yeah.
How do you feel about whether tax policy should seek to influence decisions around family?
Well, I would do want to underline what Elaine said. I think making the tax code and our social benefits more legible to parents is definitely something that we sort of underrate, I think, in policy circles and should be a focus of conversation. But to your point, I think I was really heartened to hear the senator talking about, I think, the difference between wherever you stand on the right and our friends on the left. I think conceptualizing plans like this as being pro-family and treating the family as an economic unit is a differentiating principle between the folks on the left who see it more as an anti-poverty program concerned with child poverty and almost thinking of it more of an individual level rather than on the family level. And so, I don't think it's appropriate for the federal government to be trying to social engineer certain outcomes. I certainly don't think the senator was proposing that, and I think. I don't think most of the folks on the new right would be proposing that either, although there may be some who would have a more prescriptive idea. But we should be seeking to expand parents' choice sets. I think that's the name of the game, and whether that's being indifferent towards whether that's having a dual income model or having a parent stay home, certainly not being antinatal in our effects and discouraging people from having an additional kid and hopefully encouraging that or at least making that neutral, as the senator talked about. So I think we don't need to be sort of aggressive culture warriors when it comes to the tax code. I don't think that's appropriate, but I do think we can be trying to ease some of those trade-offs as much as possible. And I think that's something where that is an area of common ground between sort of the more aggressive pro-family folks on the right and some folks on the left and maybe some folks from the center as well.
Angela, you are not NatCon adjacent, I would say. Family policy, what could go wrong?
Family policy, what could go wrong in terms of using the tax code for family policy? Yes. I mean, to this question about incentives in the tax code, to me, I kind of think of it in the opposite direction, that we have family policies where we are trying to provide, at least at the federal level, assistance to low-income families because that's what we've decided we want to do as a society. How do we address the disincentives that are inherent in that? Like, we know from AFDC that people reduced employment, they reduced marriage. How can we structure policies to address those disincentives? Not necessarily thinking about it from the perspective, how do we incentivize behavior? Because it does make me uncomfortable to think about using federal tax policy to try to change people's behavior, to Patrick's point. And I'll just remind people, so the earned income tax credit came from President Nixon's attempt to do a negative income tax. And the reason the EITC was supported in contrast to that was because it had the work component. So that actually in the 1970s is how that gained support, because Democrats and Republicans were concerned about the work disincentives built into a negative income tax. So this issue goes back decades in terms of how do we address the unintended consequences of not only tax policy, but just our safety net policies in general. And I think that's the key. How do we minimize the disincentives rather than trying to use federal policy to somehow socially engineer or somehow change behaviors in what we perceive society is a desirable way?
I would say, I mean, it's rather erroneous to talk about this even as tax policy. Where the rubber hits the road with this policy is in the cash outlays for families that don't owe any income tax. That's where all the money is, and this is effectively a welfare policy. The refundable tax credit and the EITC are both those things. They're primarily not taxes. They're operated through the tax code, but they're checks in the mail to families that aren't paying or owing any tax. And that's fine, okay? But when you're doing that, you have to understand the moral hazard of what you're doing. If you're paying people not to be married and not to work, you achieve that result. And so the welfare system, at least in foundation since 1996, has said, we don't want to be so much in the business of paying people not to work and not to marry. The EITC and the refundable child credit are 2 of 90 programs that provide assistance to low-income people at $1.2 trillion. Every single one of those programs has anti-marriage incentives in it. So it says to a low-income mother and father, if you get married, we take stuff away from you, okay? We should stop doing that, okay? That is a harmful thing to do. It is an evil thing to do, and we should not be doing it. And the Romney proposal is, in my mind, a step in the right direction because it does reduce those marriage penalties, okay? If you want to be in the business of saying to a young mother and father that each earn $15,000 a year, fine, cohabit, or dad, you can walk off, but boy, if you get married, we're going to take $8,000, $10,000 of welfare away from you. Go ahead, have your own life. You shouldn't be doing that, and that's what we're doing. And if you stay with the status quo, you're quiescent with that, you're supporting it. That's a terrible thing to be doing. We should be stopping it. And we have no problem in public policy giving values and messages of values. Do we tell people to graduate from high school? We bet we do. Why? Because it's in their best interest. It's in the best interest of society. Do we tell people not to use opioids? Yes, we do, okay? Because it'll keep you alive, all right? And we should also be telling, because if you understand this, every social problem that you hear, the nexus of it is the collapse of marriage, okay? Let's just take one. Whether or not a child is sexually molested in their minority, it's 10 times more likely for a young person to be sexually molested if they are in a single-parent household with a boyfriend in the household than if they're in a married couple household. Every single indicator you could look at, opioid deaths, unmarried men with moderate education, okay? The fact that they're not married has emptied out their lives. Crime, and that's why they have a large reason to be on drugs. Crime is completely connected to the collapse of marriage in certain neighborhoods. So at the very least, we should say do no harm. Let's not penalize low-income parents when they do the right thing that's in their benefit, it's in social benefit. Happiness also is the number 2 indicator. Marriage is the number 2 indicator for human happiness, okay? We should be supporting it, not penalizing it, which is what we do.
So one more question before we go to Q&A. Following up on a question that was asked of Senator Romney about men. Are there ways that we think policy could better support low-income families by addressing some of the challenges, responsibilities of men? Start with you, Angela.
Yeah, that is a tough one, and it's something we've been kind of searching for, right, from a policy perspective for a number of years. There's kind of tweaks that you can make in the current safety net in terms of child support policy, for sure. There's things like in SNAP, which is now really, in essence, our largest income support program. There could be a child support requirement, for example, that if you're unmarried and you're receiving SNAP, you have to try to locate the father and then engage them in child support. So I do think that there's things there that can be done. But I think this issue is largely one that is cultural, for lack of a better term. It is around expectations. What are the expectations for young people today? It should be graduate high school. I'm going to go to the success sequence. Graduate high school. If you graduate high school, get married, get a job, wait to have children until after you're married, your likelihood of success is much greater than if you do not follow that path. And we can argue about the empirical base for the success sequence, but really the success sequence is kind of baked into the value system that we have in this country. So we should be trying to make young people successful on that path and design our policies and really design kind of everything we do from a public policy perspective around that ideal and help people try to achieve that ideal.
So I think one thing we could do is design tax policy to support multiple caregivers. So one of the issues in the tax system is only one person qualifies for the child tax credit for a single child. That's a problem when we're trying to encourage multiple caregivers to, support the child. So we could figure out a way to split benefits. If you are caring for a child, even if you're not married, there was a proposal in Build Back Better to do that in the second year, I think. It's not that that was perfect, but it's directionally correct. It encourages both parents to be active in that child's life. The second thing, I feel like I would be remiss in saying the success sequence has been talked about a lot. In a post-Dobbs world, it is potentially being disrupted, and I think policy is going to need to recognize that and think about how we're going to support very young mothers potentially, or other folks who are going to end up being mothers that might not have intended to. The other thing we can do that I want to correct is that prior to Build Back Better and today, we have a child tax credit that provides the lowest average benefits to the families in the bottom 20% of the income distribution. That's by design. And then we get roughly flat benefits to those middle income quintiles, and then high income people, very high income people don't qualify for the credit. In the American Rescue Plan, we changed that. It wasn't that we were giving more benefits to low-income families than others. It's that we were giving them the same benefits we were giving to other families. We had a credit that treated low-income kids the same as we treated those middle-income kids. That meant that 27 million children who were previously denied the full benefit were getting the benefits. So it wasn't that we were over-subsidizing these low-income kids. We were just bringing them up to par with those middle-income families.
But just to add, the EITC does provide kind of that added benefit to those low-income families.
Right, so those benefits are absolutely concentrated.
Separate, but
it's sort of that second income quintile that really benefits from the earned income tax credit. It's still, benefits are on average lower for families in that lowest income quintile. That also is by design. And so my argument is we ought to be thinking about those things together. I like those ideas that there's a work component in the EITC, and there's a child benefit in a child program. It's simple to understand.
Quick last thoughts from Robert, and then we'll give Patrick the last word.
The Build Back Better bill basically gave disproportionate benefits to non-working single moms, and it increased the marriage penalties. That's what this does. The reality is about child support is that about 1 in 4 children in the United States are born to a non-married mother who is cohabiting with the biological father at the time of birth. 30% are kids that were born to, are parents who cohabited at the time of conception. Now, what's the deal there? You want child support out of those dads? This is based on this absolutely fossil idea about deadbeat dads, and the problem here, marriages, we have too many deadbeat dads. These guys are in the home, okay, and half of them, as it is now, are going to marry. So that's 12% of all children. Their child is born outside of marriage, but the parents go on and marry, and the marriages are fairly high stability. Now, what do you want to do? Go into those families and jack some child support out of them? No. What you want to do is first of all say to that family, if you do get married, we're not going to whack you with a $9,000 cut in welfare benefits, which is what we currently say. And then we could give them some actual education about the success sequence, about the importance of marriage to children and to adults, and about what the likelihood is that their relationship will stay together because they're not intent on having a failed relationship.
So I want to make sure Patrick gets in, and then we'll have time for a couple of questions.
Sure, I'll try to be really quick. I was just going to say, in response to Robert, I think probably all of us on this panel and most people in DC agree with the idea of marriage penalties is not great. It should be addressed. The question is, do you do that by investing or disinvesting, right? And so you can either make the married benefit 2x what the single person gets, or you can lower the single person down so they're getting half of what the married person gets. And so, that's going to look different across different safety net programs. One that I'll just throw out there that I like is very small, but the student loan deduction right now is the same whether you're single or married. And I think that's ridiculous. And Senator Hartzler of Missouri had a bill to expand that, so it's twice as much if you get married. That's a very small marriage penalty. I don't think it impacts that many people, but that's a real investment of money, and especially in a high inflation environment, we have to be thinking about where we're going to invest to address some of those penalties that Robert talked about. But in response to Scott's question, I'll just flag two things. The senator mentioned Senator Rubio's bill, which would start child support at conception. I think that's the right way to go, especially in a post-Dobbs world. And there's a recently signed bill in Florida. Governor DeSantis signed a bill, sort of a grab bag of different fatherhood-related ideas. But one of them was putting more money into the child support program and giving those fathers better access to case management support and job training and other things to try to increase engagement. And there's been some evaluations of similar approaches, I think, and maybe in Wisconsin, that showed that it increased dads' involvement in their kids' lives. And so I think giving states money to kind of play around with child support programs and helping dads kind of develop the earnings potential to be a provider, I think could be one way I would really stress trying to get dads involved.
All right, we're going to do some rapid fire questions. We've got one I saw over here.
I'm not sure it's going to be rapid fire. I'm Carl Polzer from the Center on Capital and Social Equity, Explore Inequality, Advocate for the Bottom 50%. So I think Senator Romney made a lot of sense, except possibly subsidizing people just to get pregnant. I agree with Robert there. The other thing is, so how do you set it? So I agree with Elaine that this is really unfair. How the current child tax credit and subsidy is structured, most of the money goes to people that really don't need it, or don't need it as much as where half of the births are occurring under Medicaid, right? So how do we should be shifting money. So in other words, why not just get rid of the whole child tax credit? If it's not serving the people that really need it, the trick is to how to set it so there's still a work requirement. I think Romney did a pretty good job so that somebody could work part-time and still get support so they could spend more time with their kids. One last thing. You kind of
Is there a question?
Yeah. Are you insulting my mother? Okay?
No.
My mother raised kids and benefited society by working to raise 5 kids. And all you guys talk about is as if work is only paid. There should be some measure, once we do this, of how much more effort the parents are putting into the kids, okay? So anyhow, for me, work is raising kids is a national security issue. So is that true? I mean, what do you...
How
do you
should
have to get
families
paid?
support stay-at-home parenting? Maybe that's a way in.
Sure. I would say that I think that's directionally right. I think recognizing that parents bear an individual cost of not just the opportunity cost of foregone wages, but obviously the cost of clothing and diapers and all that sort of stuff. That's borne on the family level, but the benefits are societal, right? And so I think the role of the child tax credit or child benefit program is to subsidize the means of reproduction, right? And get resources to parents. And again, that's why I conceptualize this as a family policy or a family agenda rather than strictly an anti-poverty one, because I think, especially in an era of record low birth rates and declining marriage, we need to be thinking about ways to get more support to parents. And again, trying to be neutral as to how the family wants to divide up that labor, whether it's having a dad at home, a mom at home, et cetera. But giving parents cash is probably the easiest way of recognizing that work that goes on in the home. And then, as we've been talking about, the sort of potential disincentives negative consequences of giving cash to certain low-income families and concerns about going back to an older style of welfare, I think leads us in the direction that Senator Romney was talking about. So I think we agree with maybe more than you think.
Let's give a chance for at least one more question, and then we'll give you the last question.
Hi there, everybody. My name is Nick Talbert. I'm a student and an intern here at AEI. This question is for everybody, though, Robert, you did touch on it specifically, and it's, how is it that we support young, unmarried, pregnant women around 15, 16, 17 teen pregnancies without incentivizing more teen pregnancies? We obviously want to support them without encouraging more.
I think you have to look at this in a broader sense. When you think about abortion and births, whether it's teens or anyone else, the general image is that they're inversely related. 85% of abortions occurred in unmarried women, okay? And so the general idea is, well, if you give more subsidies, then you'll have lower abortions, or if you have more abortions, then you'll have fewer non-marital births. Everybody, that's not true, okay? That's not what's going on here. And so this might be the most important thing I think you could take out of this. This is welfare in the context of the Dobbs decision. When Roe v. Wade was enacted, so the image then would have been, oh, well, now we're going to have abortion, so we'll have fewer at-risk births and greater family structure and so forth. That's not what happened at all, okay? What happened is, because this image of that there's a trade-off there assumes the number of non-marital pregnancies is constant. It's not. It's highly flexible and it's highly responsive to policies. So what happened when Roe v. Wade came in is that the number of non-marital pregnancies went up from about 900,000 a year up to 2.5 million, okay? And there's a massive increase not only in abortion, but in non-marital births. That's when marriage really starts to collapse. And that's because abortion and as well was encouraging non-marital sexual activity, it was discouraging marriage, and this is an explosion. When does that huge increase in non-marital pregnancy, which is the undercursor of all abortion as well as all non-marital births, when does that stop going up? Welfare reform, okay? Welfare reform is not principally about work. It is about stopping the collapse of the family. So if you give the slightest hoot in the world about families and the well-being of children, you don't want to go back into this system of heavily subsidizing not only teen births, but single parents in general. You don't have no assistance, but you certainly don't go back into this idea of subsidizing non-working single mothers for year after year after year to stay with their kids. Every research that was done 25 years ago, that's absolute disaster for everybody, okay? But that is in fact what the Build Back Better bill was sneaking in. What we want to do for those families, instead of collecting child support, is helping those cohabiting parents, 1 in 4 children in the US this year, helping them to sustain their goal of having a long-term relationship will last by not penalizing them and providing them with the skills to strengthen their relationships.
Okay, one last question right here.
Hi, Emma Waters, the Heritage Foundation. So I completely agree with Robert Rector's assessment of child support over the years, and not just because we're colleagues, but when child support was implemented, it was largely seen as a way to catch deadbeat dads. But over the years, you've seen a progression of deadbeat dad to dead broke dad of like the Obama era to today something similar to a disconnected dad. So like he said, majority of fathers are either cohabitating or involved in the life of the child. So it seems like when it comes to our family policies that we should probably reconceptualize the philosophy behind it. So when Nixon introduced his family assistance program, to other iterations of welfare to 1996 to today. I was wondering if any of the panelists would weigh in maybe on the different circumstances that we find ourselves in today that should maybe shape and help us determine like what a new family policy should look like today. Because we're dealing with a different circumstance and we're dealing, I think, with different issues than we were looking at when these welfare and family policies were first instituted in the 20th century.
Angela, you want to take this one? You've spent a lot of time with the family assistance plan.
Yes, and I'll just say too, I think that the perception was deadbeat dads in the 90s, but actually that wasn't reality even in the 90s. We know from the Fragile Families study, which was a longitudinal study out of Princeton that now has 15 or maybe even 19 years of data, that those parents, even in the 90s, were largely cohabitating. But what we know is those relationships do not stay together. By the time the baby is around 3, those relationships have largely disintegrated. So I agree with Robert. Maybe there's something public policy-wise we could do to try to keep those relationships together. But the reality is most of those relationships break up. And that's, in my mind, where child support does play an important role once those relationships do break up. So I think that you're right, that we need to look at the data to see if we are dealing with a different context, but I think we still are kind of largely dealing with similar issues as we were even in the 90s, and that's why these issues keep coming back. Why employment's important, why marriage is important, because the kind of foundation, those values we talk about haven't changed a whole lot in the last 3+ decades.
I could just toss on to that, though. I think I'm very familiar with fragile families. I think things have actually changed. They're not only a much larger number. When you're looking at non-marital births, they used to be predominantly single moms. Now they're overwhelmingly cohabiting couples, and they're not exactly the same. So the most recent data that they were 20 years, 30 years ago, the most recent data that I've seen would suggest that of these cohabiting couples that are not married at the time of birth, about half of them will marry, and that those marriages are in fact as high quality and as enduring as kind of any other marriage. And that's pretty remarkable, okay? That shows us a huge opportunity, okay, to move that forward. Now, on the other end, if they don't get married, that relationship will disappear. So one thing you can clearly tell them is, if you want this relationship and the relationship with the child here, first of all, explain to them it's much better for the child if they can stay together, and that being married is an integral part of that, because it involves an internal, interpersonal and social commitment, which helps the relationship sustain itself. And they don't understand that kind of thing. They don't have that. They may often don't have very much experience with marriage in their family around them. Let's give them the skills, and let's first of all say to them, by the way, you know, what we say now is, we'd like you to get married, but by the way, here's an $8,000 welfare hit if you do that. We'll take this money away. Stop doing that, okay? Just stop doing it. And people will say, oh yeah, we ought to get rid of the marriage penalty. The left will not support that. They don't care about it, okay? That, if you're in favor of children, you're in favor of marriage, you get rid of those marriage penalties, and you recognize that you have 1 in 4 children born with a biological mother and father there. Let's find a way to keep them together instead of talking about how we collect child support after the guy leaves.
Last word from Robert. Thank you all for attending. Thanks to our RAs for putting this on. And hope you'll continue to research the topic yourselves and explore the work of our scholars here and elsewhere.